Some wounds don't bleed. They just stop a person from speaking. The cargo docks of Meridian Station groaned under the weight of another incoming freighter as Ethan Cole tightened the seals on a broken coolant valve with numb fingers. Frost clung to the dark stubble along his jaw while steam curled around the steel walkway beneath his boots. Somewhere deep below the station floor, engines the size of apartment buildings rumbled like distant thunder. 12-hour shifts had turned into 16 ever since the winter routes opened across the outer colonies, and the station already smelled like overheated wiring, machine oil, and tired people. Ethan wiped grease from his hands with an old rag and glanced through the docking bay window. Outside, snow drifted across the endless blackness of spaceport glass, while cargo shuttles moved through the storm like ghosts with blinking lights. The radio clipped to his jacket crackled with static before a dispatcher's voice pushed through. Dock 7 cleanup crew needed. Abandoned freight vessel. Probably squatters again. Ethan exhaled slowly. Copy that. He grabbed his flashlight from the toolbox and headed toward the lower bay. The elevators on Meridian Station rarely worked properly during cold season, so he took the maintenance stairs instead. Metal steps echoed under his boots while pipes hissed overhead. The deeper he went, the quieter the station became. Fewer voices. Less light. Just the hum of old generators and the occasional shiver of steel walls under pressure shifts. Dock 7 sat at the edge of the station where unwanted ships usually ended up. Most were stripped for parts before the paperwork even cleared. The freight vessel waiting there looked half dead already. Rust covered the hull in long streaks, and one of the landing gears leaned at an angle like it might collapse. Ethan climbed aboard through the side ramp, flashlight beam cutting through darkness thick with frozen air. Empty food packs littered the floor beside overturned crates. Someone had left in a hurry, or been forced to. He moved carefully through the narrow cargo corridor, boots crunching over shattered plastic. A faint sound stopped him near. The back compartment. Not movement. Breathing. Small. Uneven. Ethan lowered the flashlight slightly. Station maintenance, he called out calmly. I'm not here to hurt anybody. Silence answered him. Then another sound. Metal scraping softly against metal. He stepped closer to the storage bay and angled the light toward the corner. That was when he saw her. A girl sat curled behind a stack of cargo containers wrapped in a thin silver emergency blanket. Alien. Young. Maybe 19 or 20 by human standards. Her pale blue skin looked almost gray beneath the flickering lights, and strands of silver-white hair hung across her face in tangled waves. Large violet eyes reflected the flashlight beam for half a second before she flinched away from it, like an animal expecting pain. Ethan noticed the collar around her wrist first. Transit property markings. Cheap ones. The kind used for refugees and labor transfers. His jaw tightened. Jesus. The girl pulled the blanket tighter around herself, but said nothing. Not a word. Ethan crouched slowly, keeping distance between them. You alone. No answer. Just those frightened eyes watching every movement of his hands. He reached into his jacket pocket carefully and pulled out a protein bar from his dinner break. He placed it on the floor between them and backed away a step. You don't have to talk, he said quietly. The station lights buzzed overhead. Somewhere outside the ship, heavy machinery clanged against steel. The girl stared at the food for a long moment without moving. Ethan noticed bruise-like shadows beneath her eyes. Exhaustion. Hunger. Fear. The kind that settled deep into someone and stayed there too long. He had seen that look before. Mostly in mirrors. I'm Ethan, he said after a while. I fixed things around here. Still nothing. But something changed. Barely noticeable. Her shoulders lowered just a little beneath the silver blanket. Ethan looked toward the open cargo ramp where cold wind drifted into the ship in thin white streams. Meridian Station security would sweep Dock 7 by morning. If they found her here alone without papers, she'd disappear into processing sectors nobody came back from quickly. He rubbed a hand across his tired face before letting out a slow breath. Well, he muttered softly, mostly to himself. Guess you're coming with me. The girl's eyes widened slightly at that. Not with trust. Not yet. But for the first time since he entered the room, she stopped looking at him like he was the worst thing in the universe. The corridor outside Ethan's apartment rattled every few seconds from passing cargo trams. But inside the small maintenance unit, the only sound came from the old heater humming beside the wall. Warm air drifted slowly through the room, carrying the faint smell of burnt dust and instant coffee. Ethan closed the steel door behind them and locked it out of habit before shrugging off his heavy jacket. The girl remained near the entrance, wrapped tightly in the silver blanket, her wide violet eyes scanning every corner of the apartment like she was memorizing escape routes. The place was small even by station standards. One narrow bed against the wall, a dented metal table beneath the window, shelves cluttered with repair manuals, loose wiring, and old tools. A coffee mug sat beside the sink with "Engine Room 4" printed across the side in faded blue letters. Nothing about the room looked dangerous. That seemed to confuse her more than anything. Ethan moved carefully, keeping his motions slow and predictable while he grabbed another blanket from the closet. "Bathroom is through there," he said, pointing toward the sliding door beside the kitchenette. "Hot water works if you kick the pipe underneath the sink." She said nothing. He tossed the clean blanket gently onto the bed instead of handing it to her directly. The girl flinched anyway. Ethan pretended not to notice. He opened a cabinet and stared at the limited food supplies inside. Half a loaf of station bread, soup packets, 2 protein shakes. Not exactly a feast. He filled a pot with water and set it on the small stove. Blue flames hissed alive beneath the metal. "You hungry?" Silence. Ethan leaned against the counter with a tired sigh. "Right. Dumb question." Outside the window, snow drifted across the massive station glass in pale waves. Meridian always looked colder at night. The stars beyond the storm seemed distant and weak, like dying sparks buried under ice. Ethan remembered his first winter on the station 12 years ago. He had hated the silence most back then. Not real silence. Mechanical silence. The kind filled with ventilation fans, elevator motors, and lonely footsteps at 3 in the morning. The girl slowly stepped farther into the apartment while he prepared the soup. Her movements were cautious, almost soundless. Ethan noticed bruises along her wrists beneath the transit cuffs. Old ones. He looked away before she caught him staring. Steam rose from the pot as the smell of broth filled the room. Simple food. Cheap food. But warm. He poured the soup into 2 bowls and set one on the table near her side of the room before sitting down with his own. "You do not have to eat with me," he said quietly. "But if you pass out from starvation, I am definitely not carrying you to medical." For a second, he thought he saw confusion flicker across her face. Then something else. Not amusement exactly. More like surprise that he had spoken casually instead of carefully. Like a person instead of a handler. Ethan focused on his soup and gave her space. A full minute passed before he heard soft footsteps approach the table. The girl sat slowly across from him, blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the spoon. Ethan kept his eyes lowered to avoid making her nervous. The heater clicked loudly against the wall. Somewhere above them, pipes groaned through the ceiling. She took one careful bite, then another. Ethan noticed the speed change after that. Hunger took over. She finished half the bowl before finally slowing down, as if embarrassed she had forgotten to hide it. Ethan slid the remaining bread toward her side of the table without a word. Her eyes lifted toward him instantly. Suspicious. Guarded. Waiting for conditions. Ethan tore off a piece from his own side first and dipped it into his soup. "Relax," he muttered. "It is just bread." The girl stared at him for several long seconds. Then, very carefully, she reached for the loaf. Outside, a transport horn echoed through the frozen station night. Inside the tiny apartment, the heater hummed softly while snow drifted against the glass. And for the first time since Ethan found her aboard that dead cargo ship, the fear in her eyes eased just enough to let exhaustion finally show through. Morning arrived slowly on Meridian Station. Pale artificial sunlight filtered through layers of frost across Ethan's apartment window, while distant announcement chimes echoed through the station corridors. The heater beside the wall had stopped sometime during the night, leaving the room cold enough for Ethan to see his breath when he opened his eyes. He groaned softly and pushed himself upright on the couch where he had fallen asleep in work clothes. Every muscle in his back protested immediately. "Perfect," he muttered. "Exactly how I wanted to wake up." The apartment was quiet. Too quiet. Ethan's eyes snapped toward the bed near the wall. Empty. The silver blanket lay folded neatly where the girl had slept. For one sharp second, panic tightened his chest. Then he heard the faint sound of metal clinking in the kitchenette. He stood carefully and found her crouched beside the heater unit with the access panel removed. Silver-white hair spilled over her shoulders while slender blue fingers adjusted loose wiring inside the machine. Ethan blinked in surprise. "What are you doing?" The girl froze instantly. Her eyes widened like she had been caught stealing. Ethan noticed the screwdriver in her hand. One of his tools. The heater suddenly coughed back to life with a loud mechanical hum before warm air pushed through the vents again. Ethan stared at the heater, then at her. "You fixed it." Silence. The girl slowly lowered the screwdriver onto the floor. Ethan rubbed a tired hand across his jaw while warm air drifted through the apartment again. "Okay," he said slowly. "That would have taken me at least 20 minutes. She watched him carefully, waiting for anger that never came. Ethan crouched beside the heater and inspected the repairs. Clean wiring adjustment. Efficient. Smarter than most station mechanics he knew. You rerouted the thermal relay. He glanced sideways at her. Not many people know how to do that. The girl lowered her gaze immediately. Ethan noticed something else then. She had cleaned the kitchenette while he slept. The soup bowls were washed and stacked neatly beside the sink. His tools had been organized into proper rows on the table instead of the chaotic pile he usually left behind. Tiny details. Quiet details. The kind no one noticed unless they lived alone long enough. Ethan stood slowly. "You hungry?" She hesitated before giving the smallest nod he had seen yet. It was the first direct response she had given him. Barely visible, but real. Ethan pretended not to make a big deal out of it. "Good," he said casually. "Because all I have left is powdered eggs and station coffee, and both are probably illegal somewhere." 20 minutes later, the tiny apartment smelled like burnt toast and overheated coffee beans. Ethan sat at the table in a gray thermal shirt while snow drifted outside the window in soft waves. Across from him, the girl held a warm mug carefully between both hands. Steam curled around her pale face while she watched the snow in silence. The station intercom crackled overhead. "Attention, all residents. Security inspection teams will begin civilian identification sweeps in Sector 8 at 1400 hours. Ethan's expression darkened slightly. Sector 8 included the maintenance district. Included this apartment. He leaned back in his chair slowly. "That is new." The girl stiffened immediately. Fear returned to her eyes so quickly it almost hurt to watch. Ethan sighed softly. "Hey." She looked toward him. "No one is turning you in." The words settled heavily in the room. She stared at him for several seconds, searching his face like she did not understand why he would say something like that. Ethan took another sip of coffee. "You know," he said quietly, "most people think trust happens all at once." Snow tapped softly against the station glass. It does not. The girl remained perfectly still. Ethan looked toward the drifting storm outside the window. "Sometimes," he murmured, "it just starts with somebody staying." For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then slowly, carefully, the girl reached into the pocket of the oversized blanket around her shoulders and pulled out a small metal object. She placed it on the table between them. Ethan frowned and picked it up gently. A damaged identification tag. Alien Transit Registry. The name printed across the scratched metal was almost worn away, but one word remained clear beneath the frost stains. "Lyra." Ethan looked up at her quietly. "Lyra," he repeated softly. The girl lowered her eyes. But this time, she did not look away from him completely. The rest of the day passed beneath the low mechanical heartbeat of Meridian Station. Cargo trams screamed along frozen rails outside the apartment, while overhead pipes rattled every time another freighter docked somewhere deep in the station hall. Ethan spent most of the afternoon repairing a damaged plasma regulator at the workbench near the window. Blue sparks snapped softly beneath his tools while old rock music played low through the radio beside him. Across the room, Lyra sat curled near the heater with one of his repair manuals resting carefully in her lap. At first he assumed she was only looking at the diagrams. Then he noticed her turning pages too quickly. Not studying. Reading. Ethan glanced over without lifting his head fully. "You can understand English?" Lyra froze immediately. Her pale fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the book. Ethan leaned back in his chair with a quiet sigh. "Right. Another dumb question." He returned to the damaged regulator, pretending not to notice the tension returning to her shoulders. Tiny clicking sounds filled the room as he adjusted loose wiring beneath the metal casing. After a while, he spoke again. "You know, most people on this station barely understand English." That earned the faintest reaction. Not quite a smile, but close enough that Ethan noticed it anyway. Outside the frosted window, snow continued drifting across the massive station glass in endless white ribbons. The storms had grown worse during the past few weeks. Supply ships arrived late. Heating grids failed more often. People became colder when winters dragged too long in space. Ethan knew that better than most. The station intercom buzzed suddenly overhead. Civilian identification sweeps beginning in Maintenance Sector 8. Residents prepare documentation for inspection. Lyra's eyes lifted instantly toward the ceiling speaker. Fear returned so quickly it seemed physical. Ethan stood from the table and crossed the apartment calmly. He slid the privacy shield over the window first. Then he dimmed the main lights until only the heater glow remained. Soft orange light painted the apartment walls while shadows stretched across the floor. Lyra watched every movement carefully. "Relax," Ethan said quietly. "Security teams only care about quotas." They rushed through inspections fast. Heavy footsteps echoed somewhere outside in the corridor. Voices followed. Sharp, impatient. Metal doors opening and closing. Ethan moved toward the kitchenette and opened a cabinet above the sink. Hidden behind spare wiring and old coffee filters sat a narrow maintenance hatch built into the wall. Small, dark, barely visible unless someone knew where to look. He glanced toward Lyra. "If they stop here, you stay inside until I say otherwise." She stared at the hidden compartment silently. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. "It is not comfortable," he admitted. "But neither is prison processing." The footsteps outside grew louder. Closer. A sharp knock rattled the apartment door. Lyra flinched hard enough to nearly drop the repair manual. Ethan met her frightened eyes for one brief second before nodding toward the hatch. She moved instantly this time. No hesitation. No questioning. Just quiet trust born from survival instinct. Ethan watched her disappear into the narrow compartment before sliding the panel closed again. Seconds later, another knock echoed through the apartment. Station security. Identification check. Ethan opened the door with tired annoyance already written across his face. Two officers stood outside wearing dark winter armor dusted with snow crystals. Their breath fogged through helmet filters as warm apartment air spilled into the corridor. "You live alone here?" one officer asked while scanning the room lazily. Ethan scratched at his stubble. "Unfortunately." The second officer glanced toward the cluttered workbench. "You maintenance?" "Engine repair." "Long hours." Ethan gave a humorless laugh. "You hiring?" Neither officer smiled. The first scanned Ethan's identification tag before handing it back. "You seen any undocumented refugees in this sector?" Ethan leaned against the doorway casually. "Only undocumented plumbing problems." A long silence followed. Then finally the officer grunted and stepped back into the corridor. "Report suspicious activity if you see anything." "Sure," Ethan replied. "I will add it to my exciting schedule." The officers moved on down the hallway, boots echoing against metal floors until silence slowly returned again. Ethan closed the apartment door carefully and waited several seconds before opening the hidden compartment. Lyra remained crouched inside the dark space with her knees pulled tightly against her chest. Her breathing looked shallow beneath the dim orange light. Ethan stepped back immediately to give her room. "They are gone." She did not move right away. Ethan noticed her hands trembling slightly against the cold steel wall inside the compartment. "Hey," he said softly. "You are safe." Lyra slowly lifted her eyes toward him. For the first time since he found her aboard that dead cargo ship, the fear in them was mixed with something else now. Something quieter. Something far more dangerous to a lonely man living on the edge of a frozen station. Trust. The next few days settled into a strange kind of rhythm neither of them talked about. Meridian Station remained buried beneath endless winter storms, while freight horns echoed through the steel corridors night and day. Ethan left for maintenance shifts before sunrise alarms lit the station walls, and every evening he returned to find the apartment slightly different. Cleaner, warmer, less lonely. At first he assumed Lyra was simply trying to repay him for the food and shelter. But after the third day, he realized something else was happening. She was rebuilding the room the way frightened people rebuilt safe places. Quietly, carefully, like someone afraid comfort could disappear if she moved too fast. Ethan stepped into the apartment late one evening with snow melting from his boots and stopped immediately near the doorway. The broken table lamp beside the couch worked again. Soft amber light filled the room instead of the usual harsh ceiling panels. The heater vents no longer rattled every 30 seconds. Even the old coffee machine in the kitchenette hummed smoothly for the first time in months. Ethan stared toward Lyra where she sat near the window wrapped in his oversized gray hoodie, silver hair glowing softly beneath the lamplight. She looked up from the repair manual resting in her lap. Ethan slowly removed his gloves. "You fixed the coffee machine?" Lyra lowered her eyes almost instantly. Ethan walked toward the counter and pressed the brew button carefully. The machine sputtered once before rich coffee aroma filled the apartment. He blinked in disbelief. "Okay," he muttered softly. Now I know you are some kind of space wizard." For half a second, he saw it clearly this time. The smallest twitch at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, but close enough to make the apartment feel warmer. Ethan poured himself coffee while snow tapped gently against the frozen station glass outside. "You know," he said casually, "most people around here can barely fix a toaster." Lyra remained quiet, but she no longer looked afraid every time he spoke to her. That part had changed slowly over the week. She moved through the apartment without flinching now. She no longer froze when he entered a room unexpectedly. Sometimes Ethan even caught her watching old Earth movies through the cracked tablet beside the bed while he worked on engine schematics nearby. Small things. Human things. The station intercom buzzed faintly overhead with weather alerts and docking schedules. Ethan settled into the couch with his coffee and rubbed tired eyes beneath messy blonde hair. "Double shift today," he murmured. "One engine fire. 2 burst coolant lines. And somebody somehow flushed thermal wiring into a station toilet." Lyra looked toward him. Ethan pointed his coffee mug accusingly at the ceiling. "I am telling you right now, this place survives entirely through panic and duct tape." Another tiny reaction flickered across her expression. It vanished quickly, but Ethan caught it anyway. The sound surprised him more than anything. Not laughter exactly. More like the memory of it. Hours passed quietly after that. The heater hummed softly beside the wall, while distant cargo trams rattled through the frozen station below. Ethan eventually fell asleep on the couch with repair reports scattered across his chest and the television glowing low in the dark apartment. Sometime later, a sudden nightmare dragged him awake. His breathing came sharp and uneven while cold sweat clung to the back of his neck. For a few disoriented seconds, he thought he was back aboard the rescue frigate from years ago. Metal smoke. Emergency lights. Screaming over the comm system. Ethan sat upright too quickly. The room around him slowly returned into focus beneath the dim lamp glow. Snow drifted outside the window in pale silence. The heater clicked softly beside the wall, and Lyra stood frozen near the kitchenette watching him carefully. Concern filled her violet eyes. Ethan rubbed both hands across his face and forced out a slow breath. "Sorry," he muttered hoarsely. "Bad dream." Lyra remained perfectly still. Then slowly, carefully, she crossed the room. Ethan watched in surprise as she placed a steaming mug of coffee onto the table beside him. Fresh. Warm. Exactly the way he made it himself. She stepped back immediately afterward like she was unsure whether the gesture was allowed. Ethan stared at the cup for a long second before looking up at her again. "Thanks." Lyra lowered her gaze. But this time she did not retreat across the room afterward. She stayed there beside the couch beneath the soft amber light, while snow drifted silently across the endless dark outside. And for the first time in years, Ethan realized the apartment no longer sounded empty when he woke up at night. 3 weeks after Ethan found Lyra aboard the abandoned freight ship, Meridian Station slipped deeper into winter. Ice formed across outer docking rings faster than maintenance crews could clear it, and entire sections of the station flickered between rolling blackouts every night. The storms outside had become violent enough to shake the apartment walls after midnight. Ethan had lived on Meridian long enough to know what that meant. Supplies would start running short soon. People always became crueler when heat and food disappeared together. The station corridors already felt different. Colder in ways temperature could not explain. Ethan noticed it during his shifts. Conversations stopped when refugees passed by. Security patrols doubled near the lower sectors. Rumors spread faster than engine smoke. Illegal transports. Missing workers. Undocumented aliens disappearing during inspections. Nobody asked questions because nobody wanted attention on themselves either. That night, Ethan returned home exhausted, carrying a dented paper bag beneath one arm while snow melted from the shoulders of his dark work jacket. The apartment smelled faintly of warm bread and machine oil. Soft yellow light glowed beside the window where Lyra sat repairing one of his broken handheld scanners with delicate concentration. Ethan stepped inside and held up the paper bag. "Good news," he announced tiredly. "I traded half my overtime pay for actual fruit." Lyra looked up immediately. Ethan pulled a single orange from the bag like he had discovered treasure buried beneath the station. "Real fruit," he repeated dramatically. "Not the synthetic garbage that tastes like wet cardboard." For the first time since meeting her, Lyra's expression shifted openly. Confusion. Curiosity. Ethan tossed the orange gently toward her. She caught it awkwardly against her chest before staring at the bright color in silence. "Earth citrus," Ethan explained while removing his boots. Expensive enough to qualify as organized crime out here. Lyra turned the orange slowly beneath the lamplight. Her pale blue fingers traced its rough surface carefully, like she had never seen one before. Ethan paused while hanging his jacket near the heater. You have never had one. Lyra lowered her gaze slightly. Then slowly, she shook her head once. Ethan blinked. Seriously? He walked toward the kitchenette and grabbed a small knife from the drawer. Okay, that is honestly depressing. He peeled the orange carefully while steam hissed softly from the heater vents nearby. The scent filled the apartment almost instantly. Fresh, bright, alive, completely different from the cold metallic smell of station life. Lyra watched him with quiet focus. Ethan separated one slice and held it toward her. Trust me. She hesitated before accepting it carefully between slender fingers. For a second, she simply studied the fruit like she expected some hidden trick. Then finally she tasted it. Ethan leaned against the counter casually while watching her reaction. Lyra froze almost immediately. Her violet eyes widened slightly beneath the soft amber light. Ethan could not help smiling. Yeah, he said quietly. That was basically my reaction too the first time. Lyra looked down at the orange slice in her hand again. Then slowly, unbelievably, something happened to her face. The tension around her eyes eased. Her shoulders relaxed. And there it was at last. A real smile. Small, gentle, gone almost as quickly as it appeared, but real enough to stop Ethan's breathing for half a second. The apartment suddenly felt strangely quiet around them. Even the heater seemed softer somehow. Ethan looked away first, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly. Okay, he muttered. That is unfair. Lyra tilted her head slightly. Ethan pointed toward her with another orange slice. You cannot spend weeks looking terrified all the time and then suddenly smile like that. People die from things like that. To his complete shock, a faint sound escaped her then. Tiny, breathless, almost uncertain. A laugh. Ethan stared at her openly. Lyra's eyes widened immediately afterward, like she had not meant for the sound to happen at all. Silence filled the apartment again. But it felt different now. Warmer. Human. Outside the frozen station window, snowstorms still raged across the endless dark. Security patrols still searched the lower sectors below them. The galaxy remained cold and enormous and dangerous. But inside the small apartment beside Dock 7, beneath soft yellow light and the smell of fresh citrus, Ethan realized something important. Lyra was not broken. She was healing. The emergency sirens began at 2:13 in the morning. A deep metallic howl rolled through Meridian Station hard enough to shake the apartment walls and pull Ethan awake instantly. Red warning lights flashed outside the frosted window while automated announcements crackled overhead through layers of static. Hull breach detected in residential sector 12. All maintenance personnel report immediately. Ethan sat upright on the couch, pulse already racing before his mind fully caught up. Snowstorms hammered against the outer station shields so violently that the glass beside the bed vibrated under pressure waves. Somewhere below them, metal groaned like a wounded ship drifting through deep space. Lyra stood near the window in his oversized hoodie, pale violet eyes reflecting the emergency lights outside. Fear had returned to the station again. Ethan was already pulling on his boots. Stay here, he said automatically while reaching for his heavy work jacket. The apartment lights flickered once. Then again. A second later the entire room dropped into darkness except for the crimson emergency strips along the floor. The heater shut off with a dying hiss. Cold air rushed into the apartment almost immediately. Ethan swore quietly beneath his breath. Backup grid failed. The station announcement returned through static. Pressure loss spreading through maintenance sectors 8 through 11. Ethan froze for half a second. Sector 8. Their sector. He crossed the apartment fast and pulled open the utility locker near the door, grabbing thermal gloves and a portable repair kit. If the bulkhead seals fail down here, the whole corridor freezes solid. Lyra watched him carefully while distant screams echoed faintly somewhere beyond the walls. Not panic. Confusion. Fear moving through crowded hallways. Ethan shoved tools into the repair bag quickly. Main stabilizers are probably offline. He checked the portable scanner. The screen flashed with cascading warning symbols across multiple sectors. Damn it. The outer storm must have damaged the thermal relay network running beneath the station. If the heat systems failed completely, thousands of people in the lower districts would be trapped in sub-zero temperatures within the hour. Ethan moved toward the door. Lock this behind me. Lyra stepped forward suddenly and grabbed his sleeve. Ethan stopped in surprise. Her expression looked sharper than fear now. Desperate. She pointed toward the scanner screen in his hand, then toward the maintenance schematics hanging beside the workbench. Ethan frowned. You know these systems? Lyra hesitated only a second before nodding quickly. Ethan stared at her. You can help fix this? Another nod. Outside the apartment, the corridor lights died completely. Darkness swallowed the station beyond their door while emergency alarms continued echoing through the steel walls. Ethan looked from the failing scanner to Lyra's frightened eyes. Then finally he exhaled sharply. Okay. 10 minutes later, they moved together through freezing maintenance tunnels beneath Meridian Station, while overhead pipes screamed under pressure loss. Ethan's flashlight beam cut through drifting clouds of white vapor leaking from cracked vents along the walls. Ice already coated sections of the floor. Lyra stayed close behind him, carrying portable relay tools against her chest beneath layers of thermal fabric. Careful, Ethan warned while stepping across a patch of frozen metal. The lower tunnels get slippery when coolant lines rupture. Lyra nodded silently. They descended another ladder into the heart of the maintenance grid where the station's heat relays pulsed beneath thick armored flooring. The moment Ethan reached the central control junction, his stomach dropped. Half the relay systems were offline, burned out completely. Red warning indicators flashed across every console. This is bad, Ethan muttered. Really bad. Frost crept across the control screens while emergency backup batteries drained fast enough for him to hear the systems straining beneath the floor. Ethan knelt beside the damaged relay housing and opened the panel. A burst of freezing vapor exploded outward. Main regulators overloaded. He looked toward Lyra. If we cannot reroute thermal power soon, the whole lower sector loses heat. Lyra stepped beside him immediately. Her silver-white hair drifted softly in the freezing air while she studied the damaged wiring with intense concentration. Then suddenly, she reached forward and began adjusting connections faster than Ethan could follow. Efficient. Precise. Brilliant. Ethan stared openly. How are you doing that? Lyra did not stop working. Her pale fingers moved through the relay system like someone who had spent years inside machines instead of around people. Outside the tunnel walls, Meridian Station groaned beneath the storm like a dying giant drifting through endless dark. And somewhere deep inside Ethan's chest, a terrible realization slowly began to form. Lyra had not simply survived this cruel universe. She had been surviving it alone for far too long. The maintenance tunnel shook violently as another pressure wave slammed through Meridian Station. Frost burst from cracked pipes overhead in white clouds, while warning alarms echoed through the freezing dark. Ethan tightened his grip on the relay housing to steady himself. The entire lower sector sounded like it was coming apart piece by piece. Beside him, Lyra worked with terrifying focus. Her pale blue hands moved across exposed wiring faster than Ethan's eyes could track, while sparks snapped against the frozen metal floor. Portable lights cast shifting shadows across her silver hair as she rerouted thermal pathways manually through the damaged control grid. You have definitely done this before, Ethan muttered breathlessly. Lyra did not answer, but for the first time since he met her, he noticed something beyond fear inside her expression. Confidence. Not arrogance. Not pride. Just the quiet certainty of someone finally standing inside a world they understood. Ethan turned back toward the failing relay console. Temperature readings continued dropping across the lower station sectors. 23 degrees Fahrenheit. 20. 18. Come on, he whispered under his breath. Hold together. The tunnel lights flickered again. Then the floor beneath them lurched hard enough to throw Ethan sideways against the wall. Metal screamed somewhere deep below the station structure. Lyra grabbed the control panel instantly to keep herself steady while steam exploded from a nearby coolant pipe. Ethan pushed himself upright with a groan. That sounded expensive. Then suddenly, every warning indicator on the main relay board flashed crimson at once. Ethan's pulse dropped. No, he rushed toward the central console and scanned the diagnostic screen. The outer thermal regulators had failed completely. Without manual stabilization, the overloaded reactor lines beneath Maintenance Sector 8 would freeze solid within minutes. And when thermal systems froze too fast, pressure spikes followed. Entire station corridors could rupture. Ethan looked toward the emergency bypass lever at the far end of the relay chamber. Thick ice already coated the floor around it. I need to reset the main regulator manually. Lyra's eyes widened immediately. Ethan forced a calm smile he did not feel. It is fine. He pointed toward the relay matrix. You keep rerouting thermal flow. I will handle the reset. She stepped in front of him before he could move. Fear flashed across her face again. Sharp. Immediate. Ethan shook his head gently. If we do not stabilize the core lines, people out there freeze. The station groaned violently around them, as if proving his point. Somewhere beyond the maintenance walls, thousands of civilians waited in dark apartments while heat systems failed one district at a time. Ethan moved carefully across the frozen chamber toward the emergency lever. Ice cracked beneath his boots, while freezing vapor rolled across the floor in thick, white waves. The temperature had dropped fast enough for his breath to burn inside his lungs. Just another glamorous night in station maintenance, he muttered weakly. He reached the regulator housing and wrapped both hands around the frozen manual lever. The metal burned instantly through his gloves from cold exposure. Ethan gritted his teeth and pulled hard. Nothing moved. Warning sirens screamed louder overhead. Ethan planted one boot against the housing and pulled again with everything he had. The lever shifted half an inch before locking solid once more. Frost climbed rapidly across his sleeves. Behind him, Lyra worked frantically at the relay console while power fluctuations surged through the chamber in violent bursts of light. Come on, Ethan hissed through clenched teeth. Move. Another pressure wave slammed through the station. This one stronger than before. The chamber lights exploded overhead in showers of sparks while the floor buckled beneath Ethan's feet. He lost balance instantly and crashed hard against the frozen platform beside the regulator housing. Pain shot through his shoulder as part of the overhead support structure collapsed across the walkway behind him, sealing off half the chamber beneath twisted metal beams. Ethan sucked in a sharp breath and tried to stand, but the freezing cold had already numbed his hands almost completely. Across the chamber, Lyra spun toward him in panic. The relay systems behind her flashed dangerously now. One final overload warning pulsed across every screen. 30 seconds until catastrophic freeze cascade. Ethan forced himself upright against the regulator housing and grabbed the lever again with shaking hands. Lyra. She stared at him from across the broken chamber, violet eyes wide with terror. Ethan pulled hard against the frozen mechanism while ice spread across the metal beneath his fingers. Keep the relays stable. His voice echoed through the chamber beneath the screaming alarms. Lyra did not move. For one horrible second, Ethan saw it happen again. That same frozen fear that had trapped her in silence for years. The same fear that taught her surviving meant staying quiet, staying small, staying invisible. Ethan looked directly at her through clouds of freezing vapor. You can do this, he shouted. I know you can. The station trembled beneath them like a dying giant lost in the storm. And then suddenly, for the first time since Ethan found her hidden inside that abandoned cargo ship, Lyra opened her mouth. The alarm screaming through Meridian Station suddenly cut off. For one terrifying second, silence swallowed the maintenance chamber completely except for the groaning of frozen metal beneath the floor. Ethan stood braced against the emergency regulator with ice creeping across his sleeves and both hands locked around the frozen lever. Across the broken chamber, Lyra stared at him through clouds of white vapor. And then she spoke. Left side pressure valve, she shouted. Her voice cracked from disuse, soft and strained like something buried too long beneath ice. But it was real. Ethan froze in shock. Lyra pointed toward the lower regulator housing. The secondary release is jammed. You have to disengage it first. Ethan's pulse hammered against his ribs. Not because the station was seconds from collapse. Not because freezing air burned inside his lungs. Because after weeks of silence, after all the fear and sleepless nights and careful patience, he finally heard her voice. Ethan, Lyra shouted again, louder this time. The valve. Ethan snapped back to reality and dropped toward the lower access panel. Frost covered the emergency release almost completely now. His numb fingers barely worked as he forced the manual latch open. The instant it disengaged, Lyra moved across the relay console like lightning. Her pale hands flew over the controls while power surged violently through the chamber. Now pull, she cried. Ethan grabbed the frozen lever one final time and threw his full weight against it. Metal screamed beneath the strain. Then suddenly the regulator slammed downward into emergency reset position. A deafening pulse thundered through the maintenance grid beneath them. The entire station shuddered violently. Then the relay systems roared back to life. Heat surged through the tunnel vents in a blast of warm air powerful enough to send steam rolling across the chamber floor. One by one, warning indicators shifted from crimson to green across the control panels. Thermal systems stabilized sector by sector throughout Meridian Station. Above them, lights flickered back online across the freezing dark. Ethan staggered backward against the wall, breathing hard, while warmth slowly returned to his frozen hands. Across the chamber, Lyra stood motionless beside the relay console, chest rising unevenly beneath the oversized gray hoodie. Her violet eyes locked onto him through drifting steam. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. They just stared at each other while the station slowly stopped dying around them. Ethan laughed first. Breathless, exhausted, half delirious from cold and adrenaline. "You talked." Lyra's expression shifted instantly with panic, like she had not meant for the words to happen at all. She stepped back automatically. Ethan lifted both frozen hands carefully. Hey, hey. His voice softened immediately. "It is okay." The warmth flooding back through the maintenance tunnels hummed softly beneath the floor now. Far above them, distant voices echoed through restored station corridors while emergency systems stabilized one district after another. Thousands of people would wake tomorrow morning never knowing how close they came to freezing in the dark. Ethan looked toward Lyra quietly. "You saved them." Lyra lowered her eyes. "We saved them," she whispered. Her voice sounded fragile from disuse, but hearing it felt like watching the first sunrise after a very long winter. Weeks later, Meridian Station finally began thawing beneath calmer skies. The storms outside weakened enough for cargo traffic to resume, and the lower sectors slowly filled with life again. People laughed louder when they no longer feared the cold. Ethan noticed that. One quiet evening, soft jazz music drifted through the apartment while snow fell gently beyond the station glass. The heater hummed beside the wall. Fresh coffee steamed on the table between scattered repair tools and half-finished engine schematics. Ethan sat on the couch tightening bolts inside a damaged scanner while Lyra rested near the window with a thick Earth novel open in her lap. She still spoke softly, still rarely, but the silence around her no longer felt frightened. It felt peaceful, safe. Ethan glanced up from the scanner eventually. "You know," he said casually, "you are still better at fixing heaters than I am." Lyra looked over the edge of the book. "That is because you hit machines when they stop working." Ethan pointed a screwdriver toward her in mock offense. "Sometimes they deserve it." A quiet laugh escaped her then. "Easy this time. Natural." Outside the apartment window, stars shimmered softly beyond drifting snow while warm amber light filled the small room beside Dock 7. Ethan returned to his repairs. Lyra returned to her book. Neither of them spoke again for a while. They did not need to. Because in a galaxy filled with noise and fear and endless cold, the kindest thing one human being had ever given her was a place quiet enough to hear herself again.